Hey, Nick. Hey, Susan. Thank you so much, both of you, for making yourself available to have this conversation, this inquiry, this dialogue. Is Trump really, really going to save us all from the evil scourge of the City of London, or is he just controlled opposition or taking us all for a ride? That's what we're going to be talking about. Nick, do you want to start? This is your second time coming on the channel. Thank you so much. Obviously, the first time wasn't that bad. You thought, okay, I'll come back on again. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself? And then, Susan?
Sure, no problem. So I'm Nick Hudson. I live in Cape Town, South Africa. By day, I'm a private equity investor, and by night, I became a dissident against the whole COVID narrative. I stuck my head up very early on, related actually to my investment undertakings, and came to the conclusion very quickly that the whole media narrative around COVID was deeply faked and false, and that there was a terrible phenomenon in the skunk works, and that premonition turned out to be correct. And I, by hook and crook, put together an organization that did quite a lot of work from very early on, and I'm talking March 2020, looking at giving a good, cold, hard look at the reality of the COVID phenomenon. And that kind of got me into seeing the world in a very different way. And I guess the reason we're having this podcast is because one of the conclusions I have drawn is that democracies do not exist in the way that they're held out to us as existing. That we don't actually have the popular will expressed in any of the West's purported democracies, and that we have really an establishment that serves up candidates, including populist candidates, like in my mind, Trump, and in the UK, Farage, to kind of placate the masses. The working classes are the most dangerous people to the establishment, and they need to offer them hope. And the idea that there is actually a candidate batting on their side. And I have begrudgingly, because I would love for there to be a political savior, come to the conclusion that we do not have anybody coming to save us.
Yes.
And I think it was my response to Susan's very interesting post, and thank you, Susan, for introducing me to that annual report. It is in response to my skepticism regarding that interpretation of that report that we're sitting here talking today. But that's enough of an introduction from me. Let me shut up and.
Nick, thank you. No, thank you for that. And I just want to say, Nick, and I said this to you when we recorded before, you are one of the many, many people that made a difference to me during that whole lockdown episode. By putting your head above the parapet gave me, and I know many, many others, strength to hold the line. So thank you for that, Nick.
Thank you, Richard.
Susan.
Well, I've been politically active since 1968 when I campaigned for Bobby Kennedy Sr., so it's really been a long arc. But I spent most of my political life in an organization led by a maverick named Lyndon LaRouche, which really distinguished itself from the standpoint of rediscovering a buried secret, which is that the United States of America actually had its own unique economic system called the American system, which was not run by central banks and globalist institutions, and that has largely been buried in the 20th century. When Donald Trump came along, it became clear to some of us that he certainly had an impulse or an instinct, whether it was conscious or not, to revive that American system. And some of us parted ways with the remainder of the LaRouche organization because we felt that Trump actually did understand certain basic principles in terms of how do you run an economy, that you run it from the standpoint of building the physical economy and not simply making money. And from what I've seen, especially in his second administration, because his first administration was largely stillborn because of all of the attacks on him, and because of his own, in a certain sense, political innocence, walking into the lion's den, not knowing who to appoint. His Treasury secretaries were dreadful. His Secretary of State candidates were dreadful. The most dreadful of them all was probably John Bolton, but I'm not sure if I would put Bolton above Pompeo or Pompeo above Bolton. But, the first administration was an outsider coming in and being under attack from the get-go and really being able to accomplish not much of his agenda. the second administration, especially on the economic front, when you look at it not through the lens of the financial markets, but when you look at it through the lens of reestablishing a manufacturing economy which serves the needs of working people, I think he's in the process of doing something extraordinary, and we can expand on that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Nick. And I'll have the links, Susan Kokinda and Promethean Action, which is the organization that you're a part of, in the description below. And for you as well, Nick, your X and Pandata. Pandata.org, right?
Correct.
And I think also your Substack as well. And that video.
Yeah, X and Substack is Nick Hudson CT.
Okay, thank you. Nick Hudson CT on Substack and X. Thank you so much for that. Okay. Right. So how this came about, Nick, is you responded to a post that Susan had posted, which was appreciative of Trump. And then you were like, I don't know, is this really so? And then I reached out to you and then suggested to both of you, how about a conversation? Now, the intention of this conversation really is an inquiry.
Yeah.
That, okay, so this Trump fella, is he really, really all that? Or is he controlled opposition in the way that I think Zach Polanski in the UK is, that Nigel Farage is, that most of the political leaders in Europe and the UK certainly are, the governments and the opposition? Or is he really, really the real deal? So, where should we begin? Do you want to start?
Rich, maybe in the spirit of just openness and sort of candidness, maybe I could lay out
Sure.
a sort of worldview, a worldview that's open to change and has changed many times in the past. So,
Nick, just on that. Nick, just on that, I do detect that about you. I do discern that about you. And I think for everybody going through lockdown, where we were presented this whole new phenomenon that we knew nothing about. Lockdown wasn't in any of the history books or any of the textbooks. Nobody talked about it. This whole new phenomenon, this whole new way that governments were operating all over the world. And then people, I think the three of us all had to start thinking, like, what is going on here? And let go of many cherished beliefs that we may have had about the nature of governments and what they're really out to do.
I said to one of my sons the other day that the last thing that I expected to happen in my life was that I would start growing up at the age of 47.
Yes.
But that is kind of what happened.
Yes.
But Susan, what the COVID phenomenon led me to was trying to develop an understanding for how this kind of lockstep, heavily propagandized implementation had taken place. As by my lights, the entire COVID narrative was completely false. There was no true element about it, and yet, heads of state and governments the world over were moved to conduct their affairs in a very, very unusual and unprecedented fashion, and so that encouraged me to dig a little bit and to try and understand what was the nature of the sort of supervening power structure that made this happen. Because I satisfied myself fairly quickly that it wasn't a case of this being an emergent phenomenon, something that happened because of a mass hysteria or a mass formation, as various commentators have put it. And in trying to understand that, I read a great deal. And the one topic that did attract my attention and has maintained my attention for several years now is the notion of an Anglo-American establishment, a sort of power structure that supervenes not just over the UK and the USA, but indeed over most of the planet, with its two main arms of influence being, on the one hand, the intelligence community, and on the other hand, the Bank for International Settlements and the City of London and Wall Street, supervening over that through a very opaque and a power structure. So that was that's my entry point to this discussion, my understanding of how the world works. Democracies are meaningless. The candidates that are put before us are all establishment approved, and it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat or Labour or Tory. They come at us likely only to challenge the other side, in inverted commas, on the peripheral issues. They will maybe go after trans bathrooms, but they're not going to go after the major trajectory of digital cage, technocratic surveillance state, Fabian-originated UN structures. These are the objects which they are very unlikely to attack, or definitely will not attack. So there you go. Could you maybe start by, I hope, pushing back, challenging that perspective?
Well, let me take it way back. There's two ways I could come at it. One would be what Trump was doing at the point COVID broke out, but I think I'll put that to the side and take it back a little bit further, because there's something very unique about the American system and the American presidency, which is why we can create something which does actually challenge this elite. Because the again, as I said before, the American system, as developed by Alexander Hamilton, who's gotten just about as bad a rap as Donald Trump in some layers. But what Hamilton established with his three critical reports, the report on manufacturing, the report on public credit, and the report on national banking, was for the first time in history, a sovereign nation with a structure whereby it could actually run its economy for the benefit of the people and not the central bank. Again, when I say Hamilton's had as much of a number done on anybody, and I don't mean the stupid musical, but rather the fact that the national bank, unlike a central bank, is not run by private interests. It actually exists under the Constitution, and its mission, its purpose is not to make money. Its purpose is to actually increase the productive powers of the population, which is what Hamilton outlined in his report on manufacture, that the wealth of a nation, and this really is where it gets to the fundamental, the wealth of a nation is, as he says in there, not money, not precious metals, not land, not raw materials, but the wealth of a nation is the productive powers of labor, by which he means lifting up those productive powers, not man as an ox pulling a cart, but rather the constant intervention into the economy with new technologies, with scientific breakthroughs, with better education, and so on. And that was the American system. Perhaps a person who got just as bad a rap as Hamilton is George Washington. Hamilton is attacked often. Washington is treated as a kindly old grandfather. You know, he was a good general, and then he stumbled into the presidency and, you know, was kind of a nice guy, and we all loved him because he was the father of our country. The man was actually a scientific and economic genius. My friend Bob Ingram, who Rich has interviewed, just did a class on Washington, which will blow people's minds in terms of his scientific understanding. And what our system gave us politically, in the form of the institution of the U.S. presidency, which is very different from your parliamentary democracies. I'm with you, Nick, in terms of the parliamentary democracies, because what is the generating force in your parliamentary democracies? The parties, right? You elect a party, and then the party chooses your chancellor, your president, your prime minister, and so on. So you're completely constricted by the parties, and parties have almost always been controlled. There's sometimes revolutionary periods in the United States when something new erupts and they're not controlled, but within 10, 15 years, the party apparatus is controlled. So I am with you completely on your general understanding of this, with the exception of what can happen in the United States. And we've seen it. We saw it with Abraham Lincoln. The British Empire was not content with losing their colony. They were not content with losing the War of 1812. And so they backed the Confederacy. They also backed the abolitionists because they wanted to split the country. And if we had not elected an Abraham Lincoln who understood this Hamiltonian principle, and he was very much from the standpoint that labor precedes capital. That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, by the way. Again, Rich, Bob Ingram's the expert on all of this. If we had not elected Lincoln, this nation would have not survived. Lincoln revived the American system. He revived the system of national banking. He unleashed an industrial revolution, which carried beyond his assassination pretty much through the presidency of McKinley. And here's another time where we elected a singular individual, Lincoln, McKinley. As I often say, my MAGA friends get a little nervous when I put Franklin Roosevelt in that same camp. But Franklin Roosevelt belongs in the same camp as someone who understood the American system, who was elected by an American population, which, especially in periods of crisis, can rise to the occasion. Most of the time, frankly, they don't. But in periods of crisis, they rise to the occasion. We elected a Franklin Roosevelt. He saved the United States, the arsenal of democracy, which is where I'm sitting right now in Detroit, saved the world. And these Lincoln, McKinley, Roosevelt, and then John Kennedy were not controlled opposition, which is why Lincoln, McKinley, and Kennedy were assassinated. Roosevelt was the subject of an assassination attempt 2 months before the inauguration, and it was only by luck somebody hit the hand of the assassin, and it hit the mayor of Chicago, who did die. So each one of these, I call them American system presidents, has been the target of this and I prefer to call it British imperial, because it's not really American. We've been captured most of the time in the 20th century. There is clearly an Anglo-American establishment. The intelligence communities are pretty much joined at the hip. The Federal Reserve is the little sister of the Bank of England. But it's, and I use the phrase too, but it's not really American. It is British. Yeah.
Could I point out then, I think sort of a potential bridge here is when the phrase Anglo-American establishment rolls off my tongue, I look at it as kind of a brotherhood of squillionaires with feet on the ground in New York and feet on the ground in UK, and no allegiance whatsoever to the citizens of their own countries or any other.
Exactly.
A criminal elite.
Yeah.
And what you're pointing to is the possibility that that elite still has its major sphere of influence centered in the United Kingdom, and that therefore the United States is not one of the countries that is in effect sponsoring this elite, but one of the many countries around the world that has been captured by it.
Right, exactly. Rich, you're muted.
Can I come in there? Because one of the things I'm conscious of is, Susan, you're really clear on the American system of political economy. Nick, you may or may not be. I've got some understanding of it, and there are people watching who are like, well, what is going on? So if I could give my take and my understanding out of listening to you, Susan, and many others. And by the way, we're recording this on Monday, the 29th of December. It's 7:28 p.m. right now in the UK. And about 28 minutes ago, an interview that I did with Robert Ingrahams went live, which is he wrote a book or a pamphlet on the Promethean Action website that it's the British that killed the American presidents, pointing to evidence that suggested that it was the British behind the assassination of McKinley, Lincoln, we didn't talk about FDR, JFK, and possibly behind Trump. We don't know, possibly, but it would fit. And my understanding, it goes a little bit like this. So when the Venetian bankers, when Constantinople was sacked, the Venetian bankers moved their business to Amsterdam. They lost a lot of money with the 30-year war, I think Netherlands versus Spain. And then what they did, they'd set up the Glorious Revolution in England and then moved to England near William and Mary, the William of Orange, who became the King of England. And the Bank of England that was in 1688, around about then, or just before that. 1694, the Bank of England was incorporated within the City of London, that already had special status and was given more special status. And then from about 1750s to about 1910, the Bank of England was the premier central bank of the world. So Nick, there you were this Yorkshireman with the landowner, and you'd heard there's great riches to be made in Africa or Kenya or India or Australia. And rather than sell your land, you went to the Bank of England, you borrowed some gold, and then you used that gold to purchase a ship, to pay for the crew, to go to Australia or India and come back with some incredible spoils. And you were now fabulously wealthy, except you had to give the Bank of England their cut. And then they took their cut, and they did this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and became more and more powerful, where trillions of dollars or trillions of pounds, or I don't know, billions, lots, was passing through the Bank of England for hundreds and hundreds of years, which then allowed them to shape global politics, shape other nations' countries, deposit proxies everywhere. How come this little country of England was able to rule over South Africa, Kenya, Australia, India, for crying out, with all their population, was through the use of proxies. And they were in India for what, 200 years or more? So they're really deeply, deeply embedded, as they are in South Africa, as they are in Kenya. Then something happened in 1776. Those bloody honorary Americans, they said, clear off, clear off. And then England lost this incredibly valuable resource, the United States, with its labor, its resources, its land. Well, we're not having that. So we're going to do what we can to try and subvert American institutions, try and capture the government in order to wrest control. So we're in charge. And then the way that England, apart from hydrocarbons, which is resource poor, has made money is through using financial leverage as a weapon. We'll lend money to companies in South Africa, strip mine South Africa, leave most of the population poor, do the same in Sierra Leone, do the same in India, in all the other colonies, and use that money to create structures like the Federal Reserve. If prior to the Federal Reserve, the United States didn't have a central bank, like NATO. NATO was set up by the British, and the US joined later. Like the United Nations, Henry Kissinger said that he reported more often to the Foreign Office than he did to the US State Department. He was the one that appointed Klaus Schwab to head of the WEF. The MI6 trained the CIA. There's a video that's going to be coming out soon about how the British fostered Christian evangelism through promoting the Schofield Bible. So you had this notion that for Jesus to return, the Jews got to take over Israel, Greater Israel. They also fostered Wahhabism, this violent strain of Islam, in order to undermine the Ottoman Empire. They also fostered Zionism. And then they used Zionism as a control mechanism for the US polity. And the problem with JFK was that he wanted to make AIPAC register as a foreign organization. Well, you can't be having that. And then the problem with JFK and with McKinley and with Lincoln, and I understand also with FDR, I don't know, right? And Washington, I've not looked into those, but I take what you're saying as reliable, Susan, is that they wanted to set up the American system of political economy, which I think is a little bit akin to what Traoré is doing in Burkina Faso, which is that our country is for us, our resources is for us. We're going to use banking to direct money in order to grow, like Traoré is doing with tomato factories in Burkina Faso. We're going to have gold refineries for our gold, which we're going to dig, and we're going to use that money for the betterment of our people. Now, the problem with that, it's really, really great for the people of Burkina Faso and the people of the United States and all the other countries that were copying this system. But how on earth is the City of London going to use financial leverage in the face of all these barriers, these protectionist barriers? And then what's happened is that the City of London, or Britain, gave nominal independence to its colonies after the Second World War, but it's running control from the shadows. So then we have the WEF, Great Reset, and the history of where it came from, the Club of Rome and all that business. I'm not too au fait with that. Being used, sponsoring this global mechanism of control all over the world through lockdown and all those policies that were in place then, including by people that were captured and run by the City of London, including Obama. And one of the big tells for me about that is why MI6 was so desperate to prevent Trump getting into power that they ran Russiagate and they ran Ukrainegate and all their other mechanisms of attack against Trump. And they've done that. They do that everywhere. Any nationalist, any sovereigntist like Putin, like Imran Khan, that arises, then the MI6 controlled media through BlackRock, through Vanguard and State Street, all going back to the City of London as the bank, the central bank of all the banks. I think, and Susan, you may know more about this, but I suspect BIS came out of the Bank of England as a globalist organization so that the Bank of England can exert its regulatory rules all over for all banks all over the world. They get smeared, they get rubbished. And I am a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I do have it I do have my criticisms of like climate change and the trans agenda, right? But he's a sovereigntist. He wants freedom for people in Britain to be free and to be powerful. Well, he has many of the same enemies as Donald Trump. Well, that tells me something. And he did have that novel injection. I mean, both of them did, the silly monkeys. Anyway, Susan, have I been a good student? Have I listened well to what you've been saying?
I think Bob Ingram would definitely give you an A. But just to throw a few other institutions in there, and again, I think this sort of sheds light on how this British establishment does it. Look at the post-war period. Look at the UN and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Franklin Roosevelt had a very different conception for what those institutions were to be. His idea of the United Nations was that this would be a place where sovereign nations, and he certainly hoped newly independent nations, and many of those took another 20 years to become independent from the British, Dutch, and French colonies. But his idea was this would be a place where the sovereign nations could basically gang up on the empires, and that the empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, would ultimately be put out of business. And when you think of the UN Security Council, Permanent Security Council, who's on it? Russia, Soviet Union then, China, the United States, and then France and Britain coming out of World War II. But Russia and the Soviet Union, that was actually the key to Roosevelt's conception of the post-war period, which is that basically the United States, the Soviet Union, and China would gang up on the empires. And he wanted the UN to be that. And what the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were to be was simply technical institutions to help with getting credit into hopefully newly freed countries. There's the famous interview, final summit he did with Churchill at Casablanca, where he said, "Winston, we didn't fight that war to reestablish British 18th century methods." And Churchill said, "What do you mean by that?" Because yes, we did, is basically what he was saying. And Roosevelt said, and he pointed to the map of Northern Africa where they were. They're in Casablanca. And he said, with American methods, we can, with investment, with water, with, modern equipment, we can make these countries self-sufficient rather than taking more out than you ever put in, which is what you were just describing, Rich. Roosevelt died. He died before the war ended. And the first person that Harry Truman called after becoming president of maybe not the first, one of the first that day was the British ambassador to the United States. And Harry Truman was essentially just a British tool. So rather than Roosevelt's intentions for the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, they became tools of British imperialism.
That does actually correspond with the piece of history that I'm familiar with around the end of the end of the Second World War. The meeting in Yalta, in Crimea, formerly Ukraine, now Russia, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met, and Churchill, according to all his biographers, felt iced out.
Yeah. I mean, there's actually an interesting book you might want to read, Nick. I think you can still you want to try and get the first edition because it got a little edited, written by Elliot Roosevelt, Roosevelt's son, who was with his father at all of these summits. It's called As He Saw It. And the description of the conflict, especially in Casablanca between Roosevelt and Churchill, is just, it just makes the story. It makes the case.
Susan, can I move from the historical perspective to the current? When Trump gets into office in his second term, he wastes no time, it took a couple of months, bestowing billions of dollars of funding upon Palantir, this organization which has its rather dark origins in the US intelligence community and in what's it called again? Intel, the name of the startup, the venture capital startup company escapes me right now, but it's a business that's been entangled with the CIA from the get-go. Alex Karp, the CEO, is a very creepy individual who can barely conceal his glee at working with the intelligence community. And Trump wastes no time in bestowing on this prime candidate for advancing the objectives of this kind of technocratic surveillance state bestowing upon them, I think, $11 billion of funding in perhaps his first 100 days in office. How am I to interpret that fact?
Well, I think what Trump is doing in many of these cases is making sure that he's in a position to ensure that they don't go in the dark direction. We're in a world where we do have these surveillance capabilities. You're in the world where the genie's out of the box in terms of AI, and you're not going to put it back in the box at this point. So if you're in that world, then the question is, who's going to use it and to what ends? I mean, AI is a very lovely tool. I use it all the time, but obviously it can be used in an extremely destructive way. We see that in terms of just the effect on people's thinking, or lack of thinking, as the case may be. And it's very destructive if you ever think that it can replace human intelligence, because it can't by its very nature. It can't make a creative leap. It might make some kind of iteration that looks like one, but it cannot create something new that is uniquely in the human mind. So you're in the world where all of these things exist. And the question is, are they going to be used by sovereign nations with the appropriate kinds of controls, or are they going to be used by the dark side to continue their march toward the ultimate, mind dictatorship and so on? I think that's what he's doing. I've used a term in terms of various political figures today, which I call Trumpification. That is, I didn't like them, or whether I liked them or not, I thought they played a very, negative role, like Marco Rubio a few years ago, who certainly, fell in the neocon camp. I see it in terms of various political figures here in Michigan, where I'm active, where they were just complete stinkers previously.
Would you say that the neocon camp is really an extension of the British Empire?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I got that impression. I was through the back door, and I think rather accidentally, invited to join the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship's first conference in London a couple of years ago. And I rocked up to find the whole place crawling with neocons and evangelical Christians, the being to a man entirely creepy, and the latter being to a man devoid of brain cells. And I think the money came from the latter, and the talking points came from the former. And there were many odd features. There was the COVID was a banned topic. That seemed to be the setup that we were invited into. This was supposedly with Jordan Peterson and Neil Ferguson, the economist, and a great number of other luminaries of the purportedly dissident community, the kind of narrative network community. This was something that was meant to galvanize opposition to the terrible trajectory of events.
No, you're absolutely right. When you go back to really to go to the neocon phenomenon, just go back to the Bush family, which is still very active today. And as I said in last week's video, I focused on Mike Pence, but you have the whole Bush wing of the party laying in wait in the wings, hoping to sabotage Trump and make sure that somehow they can control the 2028 narrative. Certainly if they sabotage the midterm elections and he loses the House and the Senate, I don't even want to think about it. He loses one or the other, it's still going to be very, very difficult. But yeah, the whole neocon thing, I mean, you can go back to Iran-Contra. And when you go back to Iran-Contra, when you look at the drug money laundering, the Contra operations and so on, that is going to all take you back to the British and London. It's not an American phenomenon. And, to get back, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, another little area that I would like to explore, and I'm just moving us along because I'm mindful of your time and how late it's getting here, and at some point I'm going to keel over. But the other reservation I had, my first exposure to Trump was as a young investment banker in Manhattan in the year 2000, and Trump was at that stage an actor in a program called The Apprentice. And I had an intuitive dislike for the man at that stage. It was everything about him was the opposite of what I understood to be respectable business and how to go about the commercial activities in a generative and productive kind of way. It was all the opposite of that. And I was very dismayed by the tendency of my South American colleagues. I had a number of youngsters in the analyst seats in this firm on Wall Street who were huge fans. And I realized that they were tapping into that kind of vein of conspicuous consumption. And, if a foul-mouthed common man like that can make it good in America, then I can too, kind of vibe. And his glitzy gold palaces in Manhattan and the plane with the big gold Trump letters parked on the side of LaGuardia Airport. They were tapping into that. But I had this very visceral I will go as far as calling it animosity. I couldn't stand it. And so for me, when Trump's name, first of all, came to be mentioned in Republican circles, I was surprised. And when he came to be mentioned as a candidate for the highest office in the nation, I was completely blown over. And I guess, so I'm saying all of this because, when it comes to producing a fake populist, I would imagine what the establishment would want to do is to choose a very good actor who already had a good name as an actor, a reputation earned as an actor, not as an actual political or commercial figure. And so for me, I read Trump from the get-go as likely an imposter in the vein of Nigel Farage and a great many other pseudo-populists that have been, I think, advanced in order to placate the working classes in nation after nation.
Well, I can follow the chain of logic, but I think you then have to, I can see why you could come to that conclusion up to 2017. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I was not a Trump supporter in the election campaign in 2016. My impression of him was pretty much what you just said. Not all that enamored of people who build gambling casinos, for starters. Yes. But then then you just have to look at what has happened since then, why he was immediately under attack. Because if he was just somebody to manipulate the masses, then they would have let him play the game and throw a sop here and throw a sop there and then pass the baton on to the next person and so on. They are terrified of this man because what you see with Trump is frankly what you get, which ultimately I think a lot of people have decided is quite refreshing, whether it rubs them the wrong way or not. I mean, on some of our shows, we all sort of say the same thing when Trump does something especially Trumpian and you sit there and say, oh, did he really have to do that? Like his response to the murder of the director, Reiner, right? Yeah. But when you look at Reiner said far, 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 far worse things than Trump forever and ever and ever. There's actually a certain method to his madness. But especially now when you get into this term, and we can go back to, what sort of started our relationship in the first place, that introduction by Treasury Secretary Bessent to the Financial Stability Oversight Committee report is a statement of intention which completely changes the direction of what we have been doing, certainly since 2008, or when we passed Dodd-Frank in 2010. It is saying our purpose is no longer to simply stabilize these financial parasites. Our purpose is to grow the real economy and lift up people's, household incomes.
So we're shifting from an emphasis on market values to an emphasis on actual household incomes.
That's right.
And one must infer, I think. Well, let me put it this way. I think it would be reasonable to infer that what's being spoken about there is the middle class of America.
Right. I like to call it the working class.
It is the working class.
Really, it is the working class. Yeah. Middle class kind of bourgeoisies out it a little bit. Yeah, but, I'm in...
the middle class of the Guardian reader.
So the people who are left over when you're done with the parasitic elites and the laptop classes.
That's right. That's right.
The producers.
I've mentioned this many times, but I'm a Detroit girl, born and bred, going back to my grandfather who went to work for Henry Ford in 1905 before there was even an assembly line. And in 1960, when I was a young person growing up here, Detroit had the highest per capita standard of living in the country. And it was because we had blue collar workers who got good paying jobs with benefits, and they were stable, and they knew their kids would have a better life than they did if they worked hard, and their grandchildren would have an even better life. And that is what, if you look at the whole of everything this administration is doing in this term, I mean, Besant is one of the biggest boosters of the need to bring Main Street and the working class. I say Main Street, not Wall Street. He says Main Street and Wall Street. I mean, I don't expect a complete conversion from Scott Besant. He's still going to keep the Wall Street side of things going, and Wall Street, properly regulated, could function in a more useful way than it does. But one of the departments I look at is the Labor Department, and what they are doing in terms of creating skilled apprenticeship jobs so that you can begin to create the kinds of jobs where one income can raise a family. Because that's the hallmark of your working class, where one income, whether it's dad or whether it's mom, it used to be dad, now it could be either one, can comfortably raise a family of 2 or 3 or 4, by working a regular work week. That's what was gutted by free trade. And that's the other marker in terms of, I think, Trump's revolutionary policies, and that is the tariffs. The empire hates tariffs, and he's wielding them for strategic, but also especially for economic purposes, and it's working. There were 100 and, where's that? We just produced a leaflet. I don't have it handy, but it points out that in the month of November, 180 factories broke ground in the United States. 180 in 1 month. So construction workers are already buzzing in terms of jobs. And down the road, you're going to start to see tens of thousands and perhaps soon hundreds of thousands where you can shift this terrible imbalance, because I think it used to be over 50% of our population back in that halcyon days of the 1960s was engaged in productive activity. Now it's less than 10. And there's the disappearance of your middle working class. And Trump, everything this administration is doing that I see and actually doing is to address that.
Can I ask you a question about a few things that they're not doing?
Okay.
One of the things that's been notable to many people like myself, who have spoken out against the establishment narrative, is that there's been intense censorship. I was one of the people who was kicked off Twitter for a goodly period for questioning various aspects of the COVID narrative, and then Elon Musk took over with great fanfare, and I was eventually brought back on. I was one of the last to be brought back on, then what ensued was a situation where people like me had to sit back and watch while Musk paraded to the world as if he had emancipated things. But we knew from behind the scenes, we could indeed read in Twitter or X's filings that they were not just complying with the European Union's Digital Safety Act, but enthusiastically complying. And so for me, one of the missing things has been a real move, and I'm not talking about revoking the visas for the good old Thierry over in the European Commission. I'm talking about a real move to put an end to reach suppression and effectively censorship across the gamut of US social media. I mean, it's not just on X that there is suppression. There is suppression across the board.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why Trump created Truth Social. He knows that he's not necessarily going to be able to change everything immediately. I think this administration does want to bear down on what the Europeans are doing. But I also... Go ahead.
But Musk is supposedly an ally of Trump.
There have been days when Musk hasn't been so much of an ally of Donald Trump. I think Musk is something of a mercurial figure. I don't think Trump is going to use the political capital that he has at the moment to necessarily pick another fight with Elon Musk if he's not doing enough on this front. What he will use is what political capital he can in terms of the European side of it, because there he's basically taking an obvious infraction of anybody's definition of free speech and democracy and going after it. I mean,
what's the obvious infraction that you have in mind there?
Well, I just what the European Union is doing, what the British are doing. I'm saying Trump is shining the spotlight on their censorship industry, which he
Yeah.
did with these actions last week. Will he do more? I wouldn't be surprised if he would. But I think, you sort of have to step back and look at the scope of the war. A lot of people want to win this battle right here. And I think Trump is looking at it from the standpoint of the scope of the war. And I think the two key areas where he's putting his most emphasis is obviously ending the wars. And there you can see the division between him and Europe and the British writ large in terms of, we all know the Ukraine war would have ended in 2022 if it hadn't been for Boris Johnson and the British. And we all know these negotiations would probably have been over not too long after the Alaska summit if it weren't for the EU and the British. And that's pretty much out in the open. And Trump knows it. And I say it as much as possible. And so do all of our other friends and so on. So he's, but it's a very difficult situation because he's negotiating with Putin. Nominally, he's negotiating with Zelensky, but he's basically negotiating with not negotiating, but dealing with the entire European Union. So that and obviously the Mideast was another one, and that's not over yet. And who knows what happened between him and Bibi Netanyahu this afternoon? We'll have to find out. But that's another situation where you're dealing with a real world situation where people say, well, why doesn't the United States just come down on Netanyahu? Well, first of all, the United States is not just Donald Trump. He's got a Zionist lobby in Congress, which is absurdly powerful and insane. And he still has to deal with that. Second, the Israelis have nuclear weapons, and you have to take into account a breakaway ally. And I think Trump has been very conscious of that and just deliberately playing the different pieces against each other, to try and tamp this down. So his two big strategic crises have been ending the war in Gaza and ending the war in Ukraine, where, he's dealing with very, very complex, pieces of this entire thing, historic, financial, religious, and so on. And he's certainly gotten farther than anybody else has. And I think he's committed to seeing both of these things through to the end. So that's where his main focus is. And then his second main focus is the economy. Because if we're going to win the midterms in 2026 and not lose the House and or the Senate, he's got to deliver on the economy. People are going to have to feel it.
Sure.
You have all the propaganda about the affordability crisis and so on. I don't see it. Well, no, I don't see it overall, but I know I'm paying 1/3 for a dozen eggs than I were a year ago. So I'm certainly seeing something.
Do I have time for one more question before?
Yeah, please. I'm good.
You're the one who's gonna fall asleep. So go ahead.
Me and Susan, we got all night, Nick.
No, I'm very interested and far from falling asleep.
Sorry, Nick, she's good, isn't she? She's really good. She's really good.
I had the privilege of having dinner the other night with Congressman Massey, who has come under withering attack from Trump, having been an incredibly popular shoo-in in his constituency in Kentucky for since the beginning of his political career, who has kind of made noises around, I think, Epstein, probably the lesser of the two issues, and AIPAC, the greater of the two issues. And this occasioned Trump to bring to bear the full power that he has. Whereas I'm skeptical that he's actually the commander in chief and able to really move much facing him against the deep state. One thing that he is incredibly powerful about is swaying public opinion about the character and integrity of individuals, and he took it upon himself to launch a blistering attack, actually, as I was sitting down for dinner with the congressman. How do you interpret that event?
I think Thomas Massey's, and there have been times in the past when personally and organizationally, Thomas Massey has done things which I think have been laudable. But I think the underlying problem with Thomas Massey, and it's the same thing with Senator Rand Paul, is they're libertarians. And that is not the American system. The American system says that there is a positive role for government to foster production and penalize speculation, parasites.
Trump knew that they were libertarians, knew that Thomas Massey was a libertarian from the get-go, and
they were from the get-go, but both of them
he used to consult him.
Yeah, but
suddenly he changed when Massey started speaking out against
especially on this Epstein thing. This is absurd. This is completely absurd, and Trump has been absolutely right that this is being used as a distraction. He's not afraid that he's going to be exposed in the Epstein files. I mean, everything's already come out. More Democrats have been exposed than him. But that it's been a way to disorient the MAGA base. And I see it all the time. I voted for Trump because I voted for the Epstein file releases. Well, I didn't. I voted for an economic revolution, and I'm getting one, and I'm quite happy. But Massey and others are, just this kind of nipping at the heels on things like Epstein. He's opposed to tariffs, as is Rand Paul, and there's your libertarian problem right there. It's the magic of the marketplace. It's whatever your impulses to get more money send you in the direction of going, and that's not the American system. Yeah. So there are I know plenty of libertarians who still have those libertarian problems who completely support Trump and are not being sandbagged on things like Epstein. So there's a little more going on there than just being a libertarian.
Yeah, this was at a libertarian seminar in Cape Town, and I'm also, like you, I'm not a libertarian, and I was simply invited to speak at the event, so that was how I ended up talking to him. But he did strike me as an eminently reasonable individual, and not somebody who I would regard as a kind of ideological or extreme libertarian.
Well, I just sort of wonder, why he. I mean, you look at him and you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, you have to ask yourself the question, there's got to be something else going on there, because they're playing such a disruptive, negative role. And I don't think it's principled. I don't think this Epstein stuff has anything to do with principle. So anyway, Rich.
Can I come in that with regards to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul and Thomas Massey? And this is according to Tom Luongo, who said this a few times, that when it comes to the crunch, they often haven't voted with the Republicans. Then also with Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she says she's going to resign from Congress, well, that reduces the Republican majority. That's actually, that could be seen as an act of sabotage. Plus also in any political movement, large political movement, there's always disagreements. I think the three of us would largely agree that we want a world where people are sovereign, where people are free to make their own determinations, where we don't have any war for imperial conquest. But we will have differences of political opinion. Now, you play it out on a much larger scale when there's more at stake than, Susan, that Nick fella. Nick, that's Susan, bloody hell, right? All those sorts of dynamics get played out. And then there's a few things I want to come back to, which have been mentioned with regards to why Trump could be controlled opposition, which is this very, very clever game, say with regards to Palantir, what you're saying, Susan, in order to control Palantir. But it could also be, well, he's doing all this to sneak in the CBDCs and the digital IDs in a way that we don't notice, and we're cheering him on because we think he's the real deal. Except there's a few other things. There's a few other things that are tells. One is, I didn't know about the factories. Building real things isn't something that controlled opposition would do. They would pretend to build real things and really send the money elsewhere, into the pockets of the City of London rather than the pockets of American workers. Then Trump has said that he's going to eliminate or reduce income tax for the poorest Americans using tariffs. Well, that's not for financialists. Banksters don't like that. They want that money in their pocket. Trump appointed Powell in his first term. One of the things that Powell did is that he got rid of LIBOR. Now, Nick, do you know what LIBOR is?
Sure, yes, the London Interbank Offer Rate.
Yeah, so LIBOR was set really by the Bank of England and the banks that it controlled in the UK and the Europeans that set the price of the US dollar. So London got to say what the interest rate on the US dollar was going to be. Well, Powell set up SOFR, the Secured Overnight Funding Rate, which now means that the US has sovereignty over the price of the dollar. That sets the dollar interest rates, not LIBOR. And then one of the things that Powell did a couple of years ago, he started raising interest rates. And that had the European Union and the UK screaming because euro dollars were leaving European and UK banks coming into the United States because you got a load of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. You're going to park it where you get much higher rates. So the UK has hydrocarbons. The European Union has nothing. It has no resources. It cannot sustain itself except through financial leverage. Well, if they're drained of euro dollars, how are they going to use that? How are they going to lever that up to rule the world through their climate change agenda and through lockdown agenda? But there's more, right? Then I look at the media and how controlled opposition are treated. So this how the mainstream media treated Joe Biden. You know, the adult in the room, a safe pair of hands. Of course, no, he's not unwell. Really? Come on, are you kidding? And Kamala Harris glossing over how awful she was. And Tim Waltz, oh my God, please, dear God, Somali Tim could have been our VP. Then I look at the state in the UK, how Starmer was treated as the opposition leader by the media. Safe pair of hands, reliable, man of integrity. Are you kidding? Versus how Corbyn was treated. This anti-Semite. Corbyn? Seriously? He's such a humane man who wants peace for all, an anti-Semite? And then how Polanski's being treated. Controlled opposition. All over the BBC, all over the mainstream media in the UK. Great speaker, out of nowhere, just like Barack Obama, articulate, not as handsome as Obama, but getting lots and lots of media coverage, saying all the right things, compassion for these migrants coming over, for open borders. That's not how they regarded Trump.
Okay, you mentioned LIBOR, and it maybe is a good idea just to step back and look at that City of London power structure a little bit. I think I can't remember whether it was you, Susan, or you, Rich, who suggested that the City of London is really in control of the Bank of International Settlements, despite its reported geographic location being in Geneva. I would probably go along with that, and I think it was you, Susan, who suggested that the World Bank and the IMF had been distorted from their original purpose and were I'm going to fill this part in. Now organizations supervened upon by the Bank for International Settlements. And so that we have this global financial architecture that really could be said to have its focal point in the opaque power structure of the City of London. Is that a summary that all three of us would agree with?
Yeah.
Okay, nodding heads. Okay, and the interesting thing for me is when I started speaking out against the whole COVID phenomenon, and it really was against the entire phenomenon from the lockdowns onwards, there were two types of organizations that reached out to contact me. The one was an NGO that was acting against human trafficking, especially child trafficking, and who found themselves after lockdown with all of their operatives stranded around the world because nothing was going through the airports and they had nothing to do. And they reached out to offer their support. For whatever reason, the people who housed those organizations also took a dim view of the lockdowns. And the other was the World Bank. I had several mid-level people in the World Bank reach out to me. And the funny thing about it was I thought that they were sincere. And the conclusion I came to is that they had been primed inside the World Bank to say, look, there's some kind of training program, the rollout of a training program that said, look, if a pandemic happens, the World Bank may have to play a role in encouraging nations who are reluctant to do what needs to be done by way of financial repression and the insertion of some fairly draconian clauses into their bond indentures. So to me, the pattern of the financial control structure from the City of London down being a major factor in the COVID phenomenon is entirely intact. Is there anything I've said there that was wrong or simplistic?
No, I think we have the same perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
And then what I was reminded of is when you were talking is how smart and clever and insidious these organizations are, how well they play their game. Just like taking, for example, the climate change agenda, I've got to be careful, I don't want to be censored, right? But that whole conversation, how well it's rolled out. I see it in the schools that I visit, where, when I was at school, I was taught that carbon dioxide was essential for photosynthesis.
Yeah, I
Apparently
mean,
not.
I asked the question, what do they put in their drinking water? Because there's this multi-generational consistency and you have to sit back and admire it. The steadfastness, the dogged determination to bring to bear this radically centralized approach to managing world affairs. And it's 100 years old. And there are families who have managed to pass the baton from generation to generation, with a particularly famous one being the Rothschilds. And they're pointed to often, first of all, because people say they're Jewish. I very much doubt it after so many generations of intermarriage. It's a bit of a nonsense story. But they also because they've actually stuck their heads up and spoken out. To the next, I think they let the mask off a little bit and say something about the particular area of New World Order kind of global governance that they're looking after. And what's striking about it is this intergenerational consistency. And so I do ask this question, what are they putting in their drinking water? What do they feed their children that turn them into these globalist monsters of incredible consistency?
Wouldn't it just on that, the intergenerational consistency, say with the Rothschilds and the uber elite, the ruling families and those behind and above the Rothschilds. So I recorded a video with Ian Berlinger many, many months ago, my first one, where he talked about and educated me about what ruling elite families are like. I don't have a lot of wealth. All I think about is what I'm going to pass on to my children. But if I'm, I don't know, the Duke of Westminster, as rich as the Duke of Westminster, or a Rothschild or a Rockefeller or whoever, then I've got a generational legacy to take care of. If I'm one of the Habsburg family members. And I want to make sure not only is my power protected, but that it rolls on and it's protected over generations and generations. The way that a king might think about his legacy over many, many generations in ways that you and I, we're not, because we're not at that echelon of wealth and power.
But there's something peculiar. There's something peculiar going on there, because the sociological observation is that wealth doesn't persist for much longer than 3 generations. When you're talking at the level of just well-to-do people in an English county or whatever, so let's call them millionaires. Millionaires are not very successful at projecting their wealth beyond their grandchildren. Whereas we're talking here about billionaires and really multi-billionaires,
dynastic families, uber elite.
Yeah, they somehow get it right. I do have a little theory on that. I've met a good many billionaires in my time, both in America and elsewhere. And what I have noticed about them is that there's only one that I've ever liked. And the reason for that is that there are people who are so out of touch. They're just protected by layers and layers of security personnel and so on, that they operate in a bubble that's kind of abstracted from reality. And I realize as I'm saying that's the very claim I'm making about the great unwashed, as they would see them. I made this statement at this seminar that people have become detached from reality on numerous dimensions as a result of media propaganda. But the billionaires are really no different, as far as I can tell. They're horrible people to engage with. They're really, and they'll be nice to you if you've got something that they want. If you offer something that they're interested in. But it's the way they treat everybody else in the room, the waitresses, the people who drive their cars and so on, every other person around them, the way they treat them is just ghastly, and I recoil from it immediately. And they're blithely unaware that they're doing it, or that I'm recoiling.
Yeah. Well, I think there's another aspect to it to think about, because they have loyalty to, say, their lineage, but they also have loyalty to a system. And, they've been educated to defend the system at all costs. Now, one of the institutions that they use is the foundations. Your point about, it doesn't pass 3 generations because, frankly, the younger ones feel entitled. They'll squander the money on cars and girls and drugs and so on. And that's the end of it, which is why these families create foundations. And this goes back to the Roman fondi, right? Where the foundation becomes the instrument through which you perpetuate. And the foundations become the instruments which really, defend the system. Classic example here is the Ford Foundation. Everything that it's done since its founding has nothing to do with the healthier outlook of the Ford automotive family. It basically became a Frankenstein monster. You see it here in the United States, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere, where the nonprofits are really the major forces in the political life in the United States. The 501c3s, the 501c4s, they frankly have much greater influence today on the shape of an election campaign than the parties themselves. And these nonprofits and these foundations, this is where you see the system perpetuating itself.
And it's a phenomenon of capture. I've got a story that will probably be new to you. I mean, you're surely familiar, I have no doubt, with the deep history of the Fabian Society and Cecil John Rhodes, the great South African mining magnate during the Victorian era, whose handmaiden, Lord Milner, was so instrumental in putting together the apparatus that was to become the Fabian Society and Chatham House and the Council for Foreign Relations and so on. The Rhodes Foundation is obviously also well known for as the crowd who sent such luminaries and globalists as Bill Clinton to be educated in the ways of the globalist mind. But within a couple of years of Nelson Mandela's death, and Nelson Mandela is a person who, at least as far as any of us can tell, was as far removed from Cecil John Rhodes as possible. The Mandela Foundation had been entirely captured by the Rhodes Foundation.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how they do it.
Well, Nick, that points to something that I've been thinking about, and which is, I invite each of you to think about this. And it's an open-ended question and not one for you to answer, but for people watching as well, right? So what if I were, by some miracle, to become the president of the United States? Here I am with my egalitarian principles, and, I'm up for a world where human beings honor human beings and we don't kill each other. And I like the American system, political economy. Sounds to me like social democracy without fractional reserve banking, which is a really good thing, right? So, yeah, I can go along with this, and I don't want this trans and people being free and home educate your kids and chill and sound money and all of that, right? And I'm now president. And in front of me and behind me and surrounding and everywhere is this system that's been in place for hundreds of years that doesn't want the ideas that I have to prevail. How would I play that game? How would I play that game so that I actually, my wife is Christian. I'm Muslim. My wife is Christian. My brother is an author in Islamic politics. His wife is Jewish. I love all the peoples. I don't want Jew, Muslim, Christian killing each other. How would I, just with Israel, get that situation settled so that people are living peacefully in such a way that that peace prevailed long after I was gone and couldn't easily be undone, in such a way that I'm not completely neutered, in such that I'm a lame duck president within the first month, or I'm not killed and replaced by some arch-Zionist warmonger neocon. How would I do that? How would I play that game? I've got enemies everywhere, and there's people I can't trust. And I was told that I could have Pompeo or John Bolton in my cabinet, and they'd be great, and I believe them because I'm an outsider as well. How would I do that?
No, I think it's really important that you pose that. I have to deal with comments, on our YouTube channel and elsewhere. And, to try and communicate to people, I mean, does that mean every decision Donald Trump has made is right? Well, probably not. He's not Jesus Christ or Muhammad or whoever, right? But people need to ask themselves that question before they start Monday morning quarterbacking. What would you do under these circumstances? I get so irritated, with where are the arrests? I want to see people marched off in handcuffs. And you say to them, have you ever tried a case? Have you ever made a prosecution stick? Do you know how difficult that is? So I'm glad you asked that question, because I think everybody should just take a deep breath and think about those things before they, start criticizing.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely echo those comments. I'm very reluctant to get on the bandwagon, of shooting down people who fail to deliver on everything within the first few days. That this whole attack against Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr., since he came into office, because the COVID vaccines are still being used in the United States, and so on and so forth. I mean, the apparatus against which these people are fighting is immense. Many decades, if not centuries, in the making, and the people who rise up in such organizations are capable of terrible things. They're not people who we would recognize ethically and morally. These are disturbingly different human beings who occupy these kinds of seats. I sometimes doubt whether there's an inner voice there at all. Whether you don't have some people walking in the corridors there who are simply not asking themselves questions anymore because they had to turn that part of their brain off so long ago,
Well,
and so these guys will stop at nothing. And it is very good to pause, but neither of us have answered your question. How would we go about doing it?
yes, I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really great question. And then people of integrity, like Jeremy Corbyn, and I think like Vladimir Putin, like Donald Trump, I would assert, not that he's a perfect human being, they're really dangerous for those that have no integrity. They're a real threat.
How do you know? I mean, how do you know that Jeremy Corbyn has integrity? Have you met him? Have you spent a great deal of time with him personally, one-on-one?
Well, not one-on-one. I've been at a small rally, the anti-war rally, many, many years ago, right? And it is a speculation on my part. One of the ways that one of the tells for me is how he was treated by the media. The fact that he's anti-war, he's been reliably, religiously anti-war. He's been outspoken against the Labour Party and stood by his principles. He had that novel medical intervention, but he wasn't for the mandates. He is pro-state schooling, but he's not for. But people should have the right to home educate, and no, that's one of his positions that's been important to me. And then there was the expenses scandal many, many years ago in the UK, and it was really fascinating. Like millionaire MPs ripping the state off by claiming all sorts of things on expenses. I remember Corbyn, his expense claim, £10 for a printer cartridge. That's it. And when he made that claim, he wasn't doing it because he knew it was going to come out. Because otherwise those Tory MPs and those Labour MPs wouldn't have done all that, getting their lawns mowed and their gardens set on the government penny and stuff. So those are tells. Now, is he a flawed human being? Absolutely, because he thinks carbon dioxide, he has a different point of view about it than I do and about the trans and all of that, right? He's still a flawed human being, but he's a man of integrity.
Can I point something out here? The stakes in the topic that we're discussing are incredibly high.
Yes.
If you come from my position where, I believe that the working class is the way out of this kind of story. And you can see lots of signs of the establishment being afraid of the working class. They go to extraordinary lengths to try and represent that they're doing something for them and so on, and to try and offer them hope. So ultimately, any kind of escape from the tyrannical trajectory, I think, will have to come from some kind of waking up process and activation of working classes in a large number of countries. But if Nick Hudson 2 hours ago it was right, and Susan of 2 hours ago was wrong, then what this event of the Trump presidency threatens to do is to create an incredible fake that leaves the working class subdued, while the broader trajectory of technocratic surveillance and the drift towards intense centralization on a global level proceeds in the background. And that would be, I think, a terrible, terrible outcome. So there's kind of like we're on a knife's edge here. I don't know, maybe that's an immature way of looking at the world, and I should entertain intermediate phases, but it does feel to me to be quite significant.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I would just come back to the tariff question, because again, if he were controlled opposition, he would not be doing what he's doing on tariffs with the intention. Because when you also think about the question of political power, all right, so if we have a population where less than 10% of our population is engaged in productive activity, it means 91% of your population, a large part of it is engaged in garbage, which has no connection to the real world. The beauty of the working class, and we saw this during the UAW strike here in 2023, the UAW went out on strike. We went to the picket lines, and we went out with leaflets that were Trump's message, to blue collar workers on tariffs and getting rid of the EV mandates. And when we first met, we were a little trepidatious. What kind of response are we going to get from these UAW guys on the picket lines? Welcomed with open arms. 60-70% of them had already figured out, despite what their union leadership was telling them, that this is the guy that we're going to vote for. Now, the first plant we went to was out in the suburbs. Then we decided to get really brave and go to the plant in Detroit, which is 90% Black, Hispanic, Muslim, and so on. And we're saying to ourselves, what kind of response are we going to get at this plant in Detroit? And it was the same. And what was interesting is it didn't matter whether it was Black men or women, because that's where Trump has the biggest problem, Black women, in the urban areas, because they've been raised in the welfare culture and so on. Didn't matter at this auto plant. Male, female, Black, Hispanic, Muslim, same percentage of support for Trump. So if you're going to grow that section of your population, create more people who are engaged in productive activity, and I always make the point that the reason that there's no demographic or racial difference is because these industrial workers are dealing in the real world, unlike your billionaires, who don't know the real world even exists. They're dealing with the real world. They know there's actual principles involved in the real world. You can't make crap up and not lose your arm in a industrial accident. You actually have to know how the world works, which is why they could think for themselves. And I think it's one of the reasons that the working class is always working middle class. I mean, one of the things that struck me, Rich, from Richard Poe's book on how the British created communism and blamed it on the Jews, was how this operation was aimed at, they wanted to get rid of the middle class, i.e. working class. Allegedly, they're for the working class. No, they're not. They want the peons and then they want the controllers. Because when you have, whether it's farmers, whether it's auto workers, whether it's carpenters, it doesn't matter. They're out there in a real world. They have to test their ideas against the real world, not their latest social media feed. And they create a capacity to think for themselves. So if Trump grows this layer, it's going to make our political process even more robust in terms of people being able to make the right idea. And they are committed to that.
Totally understand that. And that tethering to reality is the important thing that the laptop classes have completely lost. And I experienced it viscerally in my own career. When I purchase a company, we're either going to sell more than it used to sell, or we're going to sell less. And if we sell less, well, that's the end of the line for me. You've got to get it right in the real world. You've got to have products that people want to buy and that are produced, and that where you have supplies and that kind of thing. It's practical stuff. This has been an incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I once heard it said that the hallmark of a great debate is it never feels like a debate, and this has been very much of that sort. I've really very much enjoyed the conversation, Susan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yes, you've brought some things to light that I did not know and had not thought of.
Well, maybe there's a future conversation.
Yes.
Indeed. Well, I'm going to acknowledge both of you. So, Nick, you've been so engaging and inquiring, like really, really looking like, okay, well, let me try this out. And what about this? What about this? Fabulous, fabulous dialogue, which is so important. And then Susan, as graceful as ever. Next time you're on, I'm going to see if I can knock you for 6 with some other curveball. I'm not too hopeful, but it's been really, really appreciate both of you coming on. And please, if everybody's watching this, please share this video, comments, likes, all that business. We're going to spread the word, because it is through spreading this sort of conversation that we get to grow the movement for sovereignty and freedom and create a world where human beings honor human beings. Rich, Susan, and Nick signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.